they would go raiding of their lord's own land. And so castles start to change at that time. And a lot of castles were being looted for their stone to build. Let me ask you, how much do you think a castle might cost?
Did you know medieval castles are in something of a sad state? That's the unfortunate news that I have learned recently, and my guest today will enlighten us on the unfortunate state of things and maybe a little bit of what we can do about it. In an effort to streamline things and make these intros as quick and enjoyable for you as possible, we're just going to start ripping right through it. For all things Memory Medieval, you can check out the links in the description. Of course, your support is appreciated, so any engagement that you can put on this video, write a review, any posts, much appreciated. That's how any of my content gets spread to a wider audience. This episode is sponsored by Cards of History. I think they're fantastic, and I have negotiated for you, for all of my listeners and friends, a 10% discount. You can find the link to that in the description below as well. If you didn't catch the last episode on whether Mongols could have conquered Europe, you'll want to check out that one. It was great. And after this one, there will be only 2 more episodes left for the rest of the year. Next up is the finances of a medieval cathedral. And after that is going to be a holiday special covering all sorts of facts and stories around medieval feasting. So, should you be so inclined, you can feast like a proper medieval lord or lady. Lastly, I should add I am starting up a medieval history magazine. More details to come, but if you're a writer or if you are a patron of the arts and wish to support this project financially, I'm actually putting together a team of editors already, and I would like to pay them. I would like to pay all of the authors who are going to write for us. So stay tuned, and you'll hear about that very soon. For today's conversation, I am speaking with Nathan Hood, who's from the borders of England and Scotland and graduated with a PhD in history from the University of Edinburgh. He's published research on medieval society and the stories of J.R.R. Tolkien. He has also founded the Pendragon Foundation, which we will be speaking about quite a bit today, and unrelated to this discussion, but you will find a link to as well in the description. He has recently published a book called Emotions in Scottish Protestant Public Worship, which is about Scottish religious cultures and historical perspectives. And so without further ado, the sad state of medieval castles and what the Pendragon Foundation is going to do about it. So I watched the video that you have on YouTube, and it sounds like Britain's castles are in dire straits. They're in a bad situation. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what's going on with the heritage sites and what the situation is.
Yeah, and I guess this story actually begins about 100 years ago, because in the 19th century, a lot of castles were under serious threat. There wasn't any organizations protecting them, and a lot of castles were being looted for their stone to build stuff, or to just move them on so they could build a factory or housing in that sort of place, which is, would have been detrimental to the architectural heritage of Britain and our history, right? Because castles are our history in stone. And so a number of organizations were set up by people like William Morris, the famous artist, in the 19th century to protect these buildings, like the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. The National Trust was also set up. And so these sorts of institutions, especially the National Trust, started to gather under their stewardship these buildings. So the National Trust and English Heritage are the main institutions in this country which look after a large proportion of the castles. The rest would be either council-owned or privately owned. Now, there's a number of things which are kind of hitting at this current moment. And I suppose the biggest kind of biggest announcement was in the last couple of weeks that we've heard in quick succession English Heritage and the National Trust are making severe cuts to their workforce. English Heritage, I think it's about 6%, the National Trust, 5-6% as well. So, we're talking substantial numbers for these big organizations. At the same time, they're starting to close some of these sites. They can't be visited anymore. And it's because their income is not matching their expenditure. They can't afford to keep operating as they currently are. There's lots of different theories as to why this is the case. The constant rising in inflation, perhaps due to the expenditure on the lockdowns during COVID or the Ukraine war, are factors. There's also suggestions that these organizations have tended to drift towards kind of left-wing woke politics, and so deconstruct a lot of the traditional history around these places, and so their members aren't interested. They don't want to donate anymore. Their members are typically people who love the traditional history of these castles, and so undermining that, you're going to lose that loyalty. So whatever the specific reason, and I should add as well, tourism. A lot of the way that these castles sustain themselves is through tourism, right? People going to on a Sunday afternoon with the family to go and visit one of these magnificent buildings. But tourism is in decline in Britain as well, and so the traditional model of relying on visitors from the local area or from abroad just doesn't fund these castles anymore. So just on a purely economic basis, castles, their future is in question because the organizations which are supposed to look after them are either undermining them in terms of how they present it. They're either not, or they're not doing enough with them, and they're unable to sustain them. So there does seem big question marks about how these castles can be preserved moving forwards.
All right. And so your solution to this is the Pendragon Foundation. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about exactly what the plan is there, what you're hoping to do.
Absolutely. The Pendragon Foundation, our primary objective is to restore Britain's strongholds. We want to see castles become what they once were, which were centres of culture, community, and commerce. And I suppose there's different aspects of how we're going about this which address the challenges that castles face today. In terms of our organisation, we're a volunteer-based organisation, and we don't kind of have government funding. We're not don't have lots and lots of councils and committees, so we can be quite dynamic and flexible to the situations as they arise. We can meet them rather than stick to a certain path. We're going to try and do this through crowdfunding primarily, and we're copying a French model here. We can't just let the French do it. The English have to do it as well. The British have to do it too. Essentially, there's the organisation D'Artagnans. They have crowdfunded 11 million euros in total, which is a phenomenal amount, and have managed to restore 3 castles, which are now fully operational and making an income and sustaining themselves. So we believe this can be done with Britain's castles as well. And so we will try to do this. We will try to raise money through crowdfunding and potentially other sources. And once we're at that stage where we have the money and we want to restore them, we've been thinking seriously about how do you ensure that a castle has a viable future? Because as I was saying to you earlier, tourism isn't a sustainable economic model for these castles. You can't rely on it forever, especially if there's declining tourist trade. You can't rely on government money because that's very fluid and is often politically changeable. But there's a kind of deeper issue as well, that castles are often cut off from daily life and kept in a bubble of you go to visit them once with your family and then they have no material impact or connection with anything you do in the rest of your life. And so that living, breathing testament to our past is totally devoid from us. And so we think that the way that you make castles, you secure their future, is by reintegrating them into activities which involve the community, whether that's through kind of rooting various industries and businesses in a castle area, or making it a venue where community, industry, and events and meetings can take place. That's the way that you keep it going and give life to those communities too. So it's a kind of win-win situation. You regenerate the castle, you regenerate the community. So we think it's a kind of two-pronged strategy. First, you crowdfund, and then you keep it going by making it at the heart of the community.
That makes me think. I've been most every day on X and Substack. I've been posting kind of like a castle of the day
Mm-hmm.
and making posts about that. Any particular castle in a particular place. And at one point, I ran into a castle in Italy that had a restaurant inside. How do you feel about that?
See, initially, the thing that I feel is, oh, is that appropriate? Because a castle is somewhere quite special and part of our heritage. It's not just a shopping center. It's not just somewhere to eat good food. It has a, I don't want to use the word sacred, but it has a magical quality, right? And in a way, does that violate that historic significance? And there's a good argument for that. And when I present these ideas to some people, they'll say, we should keep them as ruins. And certainly some castles maybe that is the right way. But what if that restaurant was selling food which was grown by local farmers? And perhaps that food wasn't just your ordinary vegetables, but actually medieval vegetables, like skrillet, for example, which isn't grown very much today, but actually was a staple of the diet in 500 years ago. Or good King Henry. Why don't we have some good King Henry in our restaurant? Another medieval vegetable. So if you start to sell things which are appropriate to the castle, and it's kind of a place which is benefiting local farmers and that community, then to me that suddenly becomes a very different prospect than a pizza hut or McDonald's being in a castle quadrant.
Yeah, I guess I should have I should have mentioned that it looked like a home run restaurant, basically. Not obviously
Mm.
not a McDonald's or something like that. A McDonald's would be crass, I think. But I was I kind of had the same reaction at first. I thought,
Mm.
that's kind of I don't know, terrible. I guess it's just it seems wrong. But I guess the more that I thought about it, there may be, like you said, you can't keep everything as ruins necessarily. There Part of the problem, I think, I guess you can maybe steer me right where I'm wrong here. It seems like part of the problem here is that there's really not like a catch-all solution.
Mm.
Everything can't be as ruins. Everything may not be good turned into restaurants, and even private ownership. Let's say if somebody comes along and they say, "Hey, we'll buy these castles and we'll keep them in their uh, good condition and so forth, the historical condition, and restore them somewhat." Even that sort of has its potential longer term pitfalls if they decide they want to sell the castles. They decide they want to turn it into whatever, a McDonald's or an amusement park or something like that. So there sort of is not I don't know. To me, it seems like there's maybe not a catch-all solution to this type of thing. Is that right?
I think that's exactly right. That on in each castle, we would need to assess its features, and that includes the actual building itself, the material it's made, its architectural design, where it's located. So for example, there's a castle on the market right now on the island of Shuna, and it's this wonderful little island. You get 8 houses as part of the deal with the castle and this land. It's got uh, sheep farming, fishing, and so on. So it looks like a really nice prospect. But it's on an island on the west coast of Scotland, so it's really hard to get to. So that is not going to be a public friendly place. It's not somewhere that people could go visit day to day. So if you're thinking of historical reenactment or something like that, it's just out the window. But traditional crafts and farming and so on, you've already set up for that. So that sort of place demands certain attention. But a castle in a town with little to no land, but you're not going to be able to do those farming things. So I think that's exactly right on that front. But then beyond that, we don't see ourselves as providing the only solution to the question. We think we're a solution, and hopefully we can bring that to some castles. But the hope is too that maybe other people are inspired and take it up in their own way as well. And there are people out there who are already doing castle restorations along these sorts of lines.
Are you working with the director of the French project who raised all that money? Or are you guys kind of partnering together?
We're not yet, but I think once we're at a size and a capability where we can start to pull this off, then I think there'd be good ground to work together there. It's we're still quite early in our journey. We launched about a month ago, so that would be the end of August, and we're steadily growing. I think the ambition is this time next year we should be much bigger and much more capable of pulling this off. So it's really about building over the next year to get to that stage where, when the right castle comes along, we can go for it with partners like the French organization.
Yeah, it sounds like a massive project. Definitely going to be some run up to that. But it seems like you got a few people on the team already, at least according to the website. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about some of the people that have come on board already. Maybe some of the skills that you're
Mhm.
putting in the bank to put to use.
Yeah, so we've got about 20 to 30 people currently working with us, and they're all volunteers. They're all giving their time freely, and they're from different countries. So most are from Britain, but we have people from Scandinavia, from America, and our supporters more broadly. I know of some in Australia and Japan as well. So it is very much an international support for this. In terms of the volunteers themselves, we have um, one of our kind of leading volunteers. He has worked on castle restorations in the past as one of the kind of architects of it. So we have somebody who has a lot of expertise when it comes to this sort of project. And that's really important to us, that we do this well and right, that we don't just rush into something, but actually we have the right people in place to pull this off, because ultimately there couldn't be anything worse than buying a castle and then wrecking it. And we don't want to do that. We want to make sure we do it so that it actually goes on. So we've got people with knowledge and experience and expertise in heritage restoration. We have in our finance kind of area, we have chartered accountants and solicitors. So we've got people who know how to kind of oversee money, which is really important when people are being very generous and donating. We've got people that can make sure we're doing it right and all above board. We have guys working to promote what we're doing, both in terms of media, but also we're going to be running events in the future, in-person events, whether it's uh, working on heritage restoration sites and actually getting some experience on hands-on experience doing restoration construction work, which will put us in good stead for when we actually have to do our own. Or it's going to be kind of educational, celebrating castles and their history. And then we have some others as well who are working on videos and streaming and other forms of digital content too. So we've got a lot of different groups, and they're all underpinned by the team who are researching everything and trying to really get to grips with the what makes a successful restoration, what are the regulations we have to come up against, and what kind of plans we'll have in place for when we assess somewhere. And that will help us to really uh, do this responsibly and successfully.
I was watching your video on the Pevensey Castle
Mm.
concept that you had, and there's the big open inner courtyard. And I think you need to get in touch with whoever's the best British boxer and have him challenge Jake Paul to box in the inner courtyard area and do a big fundraiser. I think that's the money shot.
I think that would be awesome, wouldn't it? And again, it would be something which is in the spirit of castles, because of course these weren't just defensive places. Actually, they were centers of entertainment and competition. Think of the joust or the duel. So yeah, I think it would be in many ways very much harnessing that vital spirit that lived in those places to have such a fight.
So you were mentioning something about the castle market, that there's castles for sale, and you just talked about one. How does that all work? Who's selling these castles? Where are they coming from? How much do they cost?
So at the moment, it's primarily private owners, a mixture of aristocratic families, families which go back hundreds of years actually owning these places, and people who, businessmen or merchants or whoever, who've bought a castle and don't want it anymore. Uh, and there's a bit of a mixture. It tends to be through various estate agents that these are being sold. Now, let me ask you, how much do you think a castle might cost? And of course, there's such a range of castles, but I'm just going to throw it out there, somewhere which isn't too small, but a kind of average size. What
I
do
would
you reckon?
imagine a few $1 million.
Yes, yes. So a few £1 million would be typical of some castles. So for example, Ripley Castle, which went on the market earlier this year, that initially went on for £15 million. But you get the building, 164 acres of land, and all that goes with that. I think there's various buildings on that land too. What's interesting though is nobody's bought that. So it's been several months. There was big splashes. It was in the BBC News and so on. So they were very much promoting it. They were really pushing it. I think especially because the family had lived there for many years and had decided to sell, and nobody bought it. So they've halved it to 7.5 million. That's a big drop in the price. Now that isn't somewhere that we would go for because it's fully refurbished. But there are other places. I'll give you a couple of examples. So uh, there's a place called Mettingham Castle. And what's kind of strange about this one is it's in the south of England. Only the gatehouse and a bit of the curtain wall still exists. But it's actually, what you're buying is actually a house which has been built in where the castle would have been. And it costs about £1.5 million. And the house comes with a reasonable size uh, tract of land. So if you were to buy that house, you get this castle in your garden, and then you could start doing some restoration work on that gatehouse. But you've got somewhere that you can make a revenue from immediately, because maybe you could use that house as some kind of accommodation or something like that. There are castles under £1 million at the moment. Uh, Typically in Scotland, on the west coast of Scotland, because there's a lot of tower houses and kind of clan keeps, which are in a bad state. So there tends to be, there's one for 750,000. I think there is one castle for £100,000, which is amazingly cheap, but it requires a lot of restoration work. So it would cost a lot to do it up, but the actual asking price is low. So the market, there isn't a high demand to buy castles at the moment. There is a lot of castles coming onto the market, and the prices, as I was indicating, they might seem steep at first, but they can come down, and there are things even under £1 million. So I guess that reflects the challenges that castles have, but also the possibilities. There are opportunities out there, and it's very likely that we'll be able to raise money to buy one of these castles. It's not a fantasy. It is actually doable. I think that's the key, and the same is true in France and Germany and other countries. with castles.
So I just looked this up quickly for anybody
Hmm.
listening. At the time of this recording, a dollar is worth, or I'm sorry, £1 is basically $1.33. So £1,000,000 would be $1,334,000. So I've seen because I've posted a few times some castle listings, and some of them seemed cheap, like $600,000 or something. I mean, I don't have $600 thousand, but cheap relative to what you would expect. You would see a castle and you would
Yeah.
think, wow, that's got to be $5 million, and then it's 700,000. But I'll get people in the comments saying something like, the government is going to charge you a huge amount of tax. They're going to there's all kinds of fees and all these other things. So what are all of the costs that are involved? Like if somebody were to buy a 700,000, let's say, 700, 800,000 pound castle, which would be about $1 million. What are all the fees and upkeep and all that's involved?
Well, the just on the very kind of basic level, you have to pay council tax because you will be so in the UK, every property pays council tax, and that goes towards your local council and your utilities for that place to a certain degree. Then you have your utility bills as well. So these are just the very basic level things. But then you've got your upkeep of the building, and because these are heritage buildings, they come with certain legal protections. You can't just change a building as you wish. I mean, any building in this country you would need planning permission for, but the because these are historically and architecturally significant, because they have value and worth not just to yourself but to a broader uh, public, the community around you, and the nation more broadly, you have to meet certain criteria. So, for example, if the stone is a certain kind of stone which is quite unique, then that would mean if you're doing any repairs, you would have to do it with that stone, right? Or if you wanted to install central heating, let's say, into your castle, if you do it in a way which disrupts the kind of great architecture of it, you won't get permission to do it. So you have to do all these things in line with the architecture of the place, but then that ramps up your costs as well. So it's not just fixing a house or fixing a building, you're fixing a building with very stringent requirements. So then that requires specialist expertise, both in the planning and the execution. So then the prices go up there too. So it's not a cheap thing to do. Um, I think the way part of the way around that is being able to identify properties which, although they are historically significant, haven't been listed as protected, and there are out there those sorts of buildings. Maybe it's because they've just been missed off, or the landowner wasn't interested in kind of applying for such status, or something like that. And certainly Shuna Castle, which I mentioned earlier, because it's a kind of 19th century faux castle, isn't listed, so you would be able to do repairs much cheaper than a castle like Windsor Castle, let's say. So it is possible to cut those costs, but generally speaking, it's expensive, the upkeep, and that's why it is a sellers. There's lots of sellers at the moment, and not as many purchasers. But that too points to the danger, right? Because if people aren't going to take these castles on and protect them and find them a secure income which can support them, then they are just going to be left to decay. There's no kind of second about that. They either find a future where people can repair them, or they dwindle and disappear. So it's part of the challenge of the cost is also part of the reason why we need something like Pendragon at the moment.
I'm an American, so I'm going to maybe talk a little bit out of my ass here, but what is King Charles and Prince William? What are they doing about this? It seems like from an American's perspective, it seems like they don't have a lot of responsibilities. Uh, wouldn't this be something that would kind of fall under their interest?
I mean, I would argue it should fall under their interest, right? Many of the castles were actually royal castles under their command, or the monarch's command, and you would think that castles being so strongly associated with kingship and just order and rule in a country, that maybe they would have an interest. But I think a lot of in the UK, the king is a constitutional monarch, so their power is limited because really Parliament, although in theory they act on behalf of the king, in practice the king has no political influence today in like executive or legislative influence. He could use soft power, and he does have a lot of kind of causes that he can promote, especially Prince William and his role. And so something like climate change and mental health, they're very big on. But I think that in itself, it kind of gives us a clue as to why they're not prioritizing these things, because they prioritize the things, they promote the things which they're allowed to promote. If I might say it in that way, they're going to get a lot of support from that, from the institutions, from the government, and so on. If King Charles was to do something which wasn't really in vogue, then he would be kind of pushed back against, and he wouldn't be able to do it. That said, I know King Charles in the past has supported good architecture, or at least traditional architecture. He's stopped some buildings being built because they were too ugly, and he has developed towns in the regions that he used to rule when he was the Prince of Wales, or kind of be the landowner of. There's a village called Poundbury, which I would recommend people go and look up online, and it's all designed to be in a traditional aesthetic. So, maybe if the king hears about Pendragon, he might be willing to support such a cause, or somebody close to him. But in terms of the kind of broader politics of today, I guess it's not a priority for the monarchy, because it's not a priority for those who set the agenda they can follow.
Here in the United States, like I could write the president a letter. I could go stand outside the White House with a sign. What avenues have you tried reaching out to the king or the prince, and or how would one go about doing that? I have no idea how it works over there.
I think one could stand outside Buckingham Palace and hold the sign, and there is Speaker's Corner near to Westminster. But I think the main way would be writing a letter or sending an email to somebody. But actually, direct contact is quite difficult. I think more broadly though, there's although it would be great to have their support in some ways, I think one of the things that we really are trying to emphasize with Pendragon is that we're not tied to institutions, and we're not tied to the traditional ways of working in this country. Now, that brings its own challenges because we're starting from further back in a way, but at the same time, we're not bound by the same rules and regulations that a big bureaucracy might have, or associations with the king might have, right? He has to act in certain ways. Now, I'm not saying we're trying to do something illicit or something wrong, but we can be much more dynamic and flexible as an independent voluntary organization. Whereas I imagine if he started to back us, then we would have all of these things sent to us about how we must do X, Y, and Z, and how we must prioritize certain things. Whereas actually we can prioritize the things we want to prioritize in this way. So I'm open to it if it ever came up, but I think actually there's a strength in being a small independent organization or charity approaching it in this way.
All right. Well, I guess I have to apologize then to King Charles and Prince William when they listen to this, because they're pretty much out. But we'll think about it. If you send over some correspondence, they'll think about it. Is there anything I'm missing here? Is there anything I'm not addressing?
Yeah, I guess that there is a lot of volunteering opportunities for people if they want to if they want to get involved. So as I was saying earlier, there's different teams or groups that people can be involved with Pendragon. There is, of course, the actual restoration team. So when we have a castle or we're helping out on other heritage restoration projects, we're going to need people who, whether they're super skilled or just want to help out, having those bodies on a construction site is going to be really vital. So there's that side of things. There's the research group who are really driving forward Pendragon at this moment in time. It's really getting to grips with understanding how we do this well, what kind of challenges we might face, and what sort of plans we might have for a castle in the future. It's developing all of those things so that we're going into this with the best possible understanding that we can have. Then we've got media team. So we've got people making videos, talk about digital projects. One idea that we've been musing around is, could we do 3D reconstructions of castles, for example? That would be such a brilliant way to bring them to life and maybe act as a model for what we might try to do with a castle. So that would be a really great thing to develop. And then various other projects. We have a magazine out at the moment, celebrating castles, sharing our vision, and we have a calendar for 2026, really highlighting the traditional dates in the British calendar, and also filled with great paintings by 19th century artists like Turner and Constables of castles in Britain. So, those are the sorts of things which people can get involved with. And, if you can give a little bit of time each week, it's so valued by us. So people can get involved in many different ways. But even if you can't do that, just a simple follow, a like and a share does the world of difference, because the more people who see what we're doing, the more chance we have of actually pulling it off. So that kind of spreading through a network is going to be so vital moving forwards.
Why do you feel like the interest in castles is dropping off?
This is a great question, and I've kind of been mulling it over for a while now. I think I think there's probably at least two major reasons, or two or three. The first is that the traditional audience, which would go to a castle, the main group who would go to castles in the last 20 years, has been 30-year-olds with their kids, so families. That's the main target audience, and actually the highest proportion prior to COVID that would visit castles. That group has stopped going by and large, which is quite a thing. And I think part of it is the cost of it. Prices after COVID have just never gone back, and wages are not really rising in Britain. So that's part of it. But I also think there's a generation, certainly my own generation, feels very disconnected from our history and our past. A lot of us have moved around in our childhood, or moved around more generally, compared to, like, my grandparents have lived in the same town all their lives, so they feel very rooted in that place. Whereas I've moved several times, so although I feel connected to an extent, it's never quite the same. And I'm somebody who's passionate about history. That's not going to be the case for a lot of people, and indeed even younger generations. I think a third of British people under 20 have never been to a castle before, which is kind of quite amazing when there's so many castles in Britain and it's relatively easy to get to one. It's not like you have to go hundreds of miles. Many of them are actually in towns and cities, so that's quite noticeable. And maybe that's tied to the lack of interest in something which isn't going to give you a dopamine hit every 5 seconds is probably a factor in that, right? Social media, and I can play Kingdom Come Deliverance and experience a castle more than visiting some stones. Maybe that's also kind of part of it. I think as well, the older generation, so you're kind of over 60s, there's a real culture of not kind of embracing going on holiday in Britain, but going on a cruise somewhere or on a tourist ship or something like that. So that's part of it. There's a kind of looking down at British history and as maybe tied to a kind of low class nationalism, perhaps. And I think kind of thirdly, and maybe the most fundamental, and I'm kind of going back to this, they have no bearing on our lives, right? They don't interact with anything that actually happens. I go to the castle at the weekend, and then I go to the office, and then I go home, and I go on my computer and watch some TV. The castle has no place there. I don't see it. I don't interact with it, so it feels divorced from real life. And so, why would I have an interest in it, unless I'm passionate about history or love my heritage? There's no natural reason for it to be connected, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And so that loss is that many people feel, even if they're not aware of it. I think that's a big part of why there's a decline in interest in them. But I'd be interested in your view because you're somebody who, I really admire your channel and I love watching all of the posts you make and lots of people engaging with the history that you're sharing with people. But you're not from Britain, and you obviously have a passion for British history and more broadly European medieval history. So why would you think that people have a declining interest in it when evidently there are people who are very enthusiastic at the same time?
Medieval history has been sort of made uncool. And whether that's an artifact of the Enlightenment or whether that's something that's newer, but I think there's been it's definitely not portrayed most of the time, I would say, as just I don't know, as epic as it actually is,
Mm,
as vibrant as it actually is. There's sort of that, I obviously talk about it and get a lot of various amount of heat for, talking about the dark ages and sort of going in the reverse and, sort of making fun of people's assumption.
mm,
But I think that is in a lot of ways people's assumption that it was sort of this, I don't know, backwards period. Everybody's stupid. They died from 4 years old. Everybody just had diseases and, they were just eating dirt and covered in poop and, whatever. It's just a backwards, disgusting, dirty time
mm,
where nobody was doing anything. There was no science. Everybody was stupid. So I think there's been a real retelling of certainly that period of history, the medieval period of history, as being uncool. I mean, that's not the right word. That's sort of like one word that you could maybe use for sort of the broad way in which it is misinterpreted. And so, when something is, I guess, uncool, people don't want to read about it. They don't want to learn about it. They don't care. And
mm,
I think that's been sort of maybe one reason why my stuff has maybe resonated a little bit is because a big part of my focus, I'm not an academic. So, um, I'm not sort of constrained by the need to maintain a scholarly reputation.
mm-hmm.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. Just I have a different angle that I can approach it from. I can basically just say whatever I want and I can goof around and I can have fun with it. And I think that a part of what people enjoy about the stuff that I've put out is that I try to make it fun. I'm having a good time, and I enjoy it. So not just, not the making, like I enjoy the history. I think it's really interesting. I think it's really
Mm,
fascinating. Of course, there's terrible things, of course, as has been mentioned in another episode, like modern dentistry is certainly preferable to medieval dentistry. But that doesn't mean that, there wasn't a lot of great things going on. It wasn't very interesting, or it didn't have a lot of exciting things or fantastic culture and all these other different things that are associated with it. So in my
nice.
opinion, I think it's just been made very uncool. And so when something's uncool, people are just disinterested.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And I was thinking about how, uh, so there's a kind of group on the right in Britain who are very focused on kind of Islamic immigration into Britain and so on. And somebody like Katie Hopkins, Tommy Robinson, you might have heard of him, and they'll say things like, "Oh, Islam, it condemns women, or it condemns homosexuals. It's medieval." And the implication there is medieval is a derogatory thing. It's an insult, and actually, that when I hear that, I'm like, why are you putting down the medieval people? Not least because they would probably be horrified to be associated with Islam, and at the same time, and I think it's something like Monty Python. I think lingers over this the Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I've always got in my mind that scene where the peasants are rolling around in the mud, and King Arthur has got a guy with coconuts riding, prancing in front of him as a fake horse, and it's kind of undercutting the high ideals that we see in somebody like Richard the First or William Marshall, and kind of making fun of it and saying, "Oh, it was all base and crass and wasn't really like that at all." Whereas actually, yes, there was the base and the crass, but there was the mighty and the noble as well. And actually, it's the whole together which is so enticing. So yeah, I definitely see what you're saying in terms of how it's been presented. But then at the same time, uh, and I think this is interesting. There's a lot of fantasy video games today which are really cool, and people are really fascinated by fantasy worlds, which are heavily inspired by the medieval. So I think it's something like Skyrim, or Kingdom Come Deliverance, or Dungeons and Dragons. These are basically like medieval role playing games, uh, but somehow we need to kind of translate that epicness into actually caring about the history itself, and not just the Tamriel.
Well, and Kingdom of Heaven is another great example. It's kind of a terrible movie, but the aesthetic was so powerful that it gets reposted all the time and is obviously well known simply for the aesthetic, because it was at least somewhat faithful in its making the period look somewhat accurate. And so, whereas these other ones, there's of course that joke about the medieval filter, where everything's just gray and everything's just brown or whatever. And so I think that I think that's an interesting point, about the entertainment sort of being a various gateway.
I mean, in the 19th century, that was the main way the medieval was kind of revived as well. If we think of Tennyson's Idylls of the King, which is the kind of retelling of King Arthur, and then the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, who were producing all these amazing Arthurian paintings. This was at the same time going in with a neo-Gothic revival in architecture in Britain. And so there was this synergy of, okay, we're facing industrialization, we're facing the eradication of our old ways of life and being made slaves to the machines. We actually need to recover the medieval, and the way to do that is through literature and art and so on, and architecture. And I guess today these sorts of games are also a way of doing that. They're a medium to do it through. So I definitely agree with you that there's a pull, and I suppose that the one we haven't mentioned, the Lord of the Rings, is also a kind of an example of this. So many people are drawn to the Lord of the Rings and feel very strongly about it. I think that's why many of us get very upset when we see what happens to the Lord of the Rings when it's kind of bastardized in many ways, and the Rings of Power. It's a kind of desecration, not just of the story itself, but of the culture it's celebrating. And part of that is the medieval. Another part is the Anglo-Saxon, and even more the classical world too. It's kind of all of those things in one.
And I suppose for me, maybe a little bit of it is like it's a little bit I'm living vicariously, I suppose, because I'm not just an American, but I'm like a West Coast American, and so there's not really any buildings out here that are more than 100 years old. So like to imagine something that's 1,000 years old is really very much beyond my experience daily.
It's an absolute privilege to live in a land with these kind of fairy tale castles, and to have that connection to figures like Edward the First, who he built in his reign, I think 14 castles in Wales, including kind of refashioning certain ones, and they're some of the most magnificent buildings you could ever set your eyes upon. I guess the thing is, as we've been talking about, they're under threat, and to lose them would be an absolute travesty, not just for their historical value, but for our connection to them as people, as a group of people. If you lose those buildings, you lose a part of who you are and where you've come from. At the same time, though, I actually think that there's an interesting kind of different dynamic for you guys in America, because, of course, these castles didn't come. Somebody had to build them. There was nothing. There was land there to be built upon, and okay, there was other, like, barrows and Iron Age hill forts and so on. But these castles were a new kind of building at that time, and they went through developments over the years. And so, to me, there's certainly in the border of England and Wales and England and Scotland, these castles are a testament to a kind of Wild West past, where there were not just nations fighting each other, but border clans raiding cattle and taking a few slaves along the way and burning villages. And so you need a castle to protect yourself in such a place. And to me, that so ties in with the spirit of the Wild West in America. So I can see very much in a way, looking at the castles gives me a taster, perhaps, of that Wild West that you guys have had.
Yeah, I can see a similar angle there. Kind of makes me think of that meme where it's got the picture of the knight and the cowboy and the pirate and the samurai, and it's like, you at 6 years old, you just pick one and then you're locked in for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which one did you go for?
Oh, the knight, of course.
Of course. Although there's an interesting, I was going to mention this actually, but we kind of passed it. Was that the concept of the knight, of course, went through various changes and evolutions, and in the 13th century, or more than 14th century, sorry, a lot of knights were effectively mercenaries. The earlier period, the knight is somebody who typically has land and is bound by oath to serve a lord, and it's a bond of loyalty and fidelity, and this would be a lifelong relationship. It's somebody like William Marshall is kind of the par excellence of this, and he embodies the chivalric virtues of, everybody else has abandoned King John, and King John is even punishing William, and he still doesn't go against him. And when John dies and his son Henry is still a young boy, and all the barons are trying to take over, Marshall stands his ground and keeps defending the crown. This is the sort of man we're talking about. But by the 14th century, the cost of being a knight had gone up. It was very expensive. You had to pay a lot to actually have the title. And then your upkeep of armor had gone up because the level of armor required to be a knight was expensive. And due to various other factors, a lot of knights were no longer bound by oath, but it was purely transactional. It was money. They were paid money. And this was seen as a great crisis across society at that time. People like Chaucer were lamenting the change in the knight from this virtuous, oath-bound person to a mercenary and a lot of the mercenaries were pretty vicious and criminal. They would go raiding of their lord's own land. And so castles start to change at that time. Before, you have a keep where your lord and his retainers would stay. But during the 14th century, a lot of castles, the lord keeps his area totally cut off from where the retainers are living, because he's scared his mercenaries are going to kill him in his sleep, basically, and take his castle from him. And if we're thinking about comparing the medieval to the modern, they're horrified at the idea of paying somebody to do a service, of somebody having a purely transactional relationship because they're not trustworthy and often have a criminal element to them. But our whole society is based off transaction. I don't think there's probably very few roles in the whole of the Western world which are purely on oath. Maybe some kind of old role where the king and a lord have some sort of relationship, but actually, like in the economy, it's all transaction, and that we are a mercenary culture. Somebody like Chaucer would think we are the worst possible people for that. So when we kind of condemn the medieval, it's actually, oh wait, their system of values upholds virtue and fidelity and loyalty, and ours is the one of the bargainer, of the person who's trying to get as much as possible for as little work as possible. It's kind of interesting change and reflected in the architecture of castles. So yeah, I find that a kind of interesting um, shift in culture, which we just take for granted.
I do think about a lot as I'm reading medieval history how they often held merchants in with suspicion. I think is maybe the way to put it. They were sus, if not outright looked down upon. Is there any castles that are emblematic of this switch in architectural style from the what you're saying, like the keep with his retainers and everything, to like a separate thing?
Yeah, so generally speaking, and I'll come to a specific example in a second. Generally speaking, most castles after Edward the First, or Edward the Third, I should say, reflect this sort of shift. Edward the First castles are probably the peak of castle building, and I mean, to be fair, they don't really have keeps. They have massive gatehouses with like 6 portcullises you have to try and get through, and then a barbican beyond that, plus a moat, so they're just almost impossible to capture. But after Edward's castle building, there are a number of castles which kind of reflect this. So in uh, I would say Alnwick Castle in the northeast of England, Northumberland, it's spelled Alnwick Castle. Uh, that was owned by the Percys, the Dukes of Northumberland, and what you've got there is you have 2 bailies, which is reasonably common, an outer bailey and an inner bailey on both sides, with a keep with a really strong gatehouse within it, surrounded by various towers. But what's key here is in keeps prior to this point, there is the Great Hall. The Great Hall, which isn't necessarily a stone building, it might be a wooden building, but the lord and his retainers would meet together in that Great Hall. Whereas in somewhere like Alnwick, you have the Great Hall for the lord, but then you have the retainers have their own hall outside of the keep. So they don't have access to this, and they would find it almost impregnable to get into that keep. So that would be a good example of this shift where you're no longer trusting them to dine with you, to live with you. And also, what's interesting about that design and some of the other castles is the lords tend to live in the gatehouses, and by this point, gatehouses share many of the same functions as keeps. They've kind of got rid of the keep as a separate building because they're very strong units. They have multiple towers, multiple portcullises, and they've got good entry and exit points, so you can get away if the rest of the castle falls. But also you can control who's coming in and coming out. So if your mercenary band is misbehaving, well, you can stop them from getting in, or you can trap them between your portcullises. So a number of these castles, including Alnwick, reflect this sort of shift in the architecture. Yeah, so I would give that as an example.
You said it's Almwick, like Almwick.
Alnwick, yeah. Hmm.
All right. And so we'll obviously have links in the description for anybody to check out if they want to check out the Pendragon Foundation, if they'd like to support you, pick up a calendar And now that we're coming to the end of the conversation, this is the part where I must remind you, if you'd like to support my work, please consider becoming a paid subscriber on Substack or using that sweet 10% discount to pick up some Cards of History. You'll find the links to those in the description. Is there anything else that you would like to add about the Pendragon Foundation, castles, anything else that maybe we didn't touch on?
I think the main thing I want to encourage people to do is to get involved in supporting castles. I would love it if people want to support the Pendragon Foundation, and you can do that by volunteering or donating. But there may be a castle that's local to you, and one that you can go and support, and you can volunteer at, that you can help a local trust with. And I would encourage you, if you can, and you want to, either support the Pendragon Foundation or support another organisation which is doing this work, because ultimately, for me, the object isn't about Pendragon, and it isn't about one particular charity. It's about seeing these amazing, incredible historic buildings thrive again. And so I just encourage people to go and support how they can, and to get involved, because it's very rewarding. It's very rewarding. You get to meet new people, you get to do meaningful work, and it's also good for developing your skills and experience. So I think there's just so many reasons, and ultimately we all love history, and we love the characters who were a part of it, and we're kind of entering into that story by helping to restore these buildings. We're kind of in the next chapter then. We're not just learning about them, we're writing the next chapter of these castles. So I would encourage your audience just to get involved with supporting castles however they can.